Lutheranism and Calvinism in 16th, early 17th century Europe. It is usual to see the Lutheran movement as dominant in the Reformation down to 1550 against a degenerate medieval church which has not putting up much resistance, which is almost crumbling before it like rotten wood. Then from 1550 to 1660, or 1600, I should say, Calvinism takes over as the dominant Protestant wave, as a mirror image to find a regenerate and reviving Roman Catholic Church, a Roman Catholic Church starting to be regenerated by the reforms of the Council of Trent and the whole movement we call the Counter-Reformation. Now, Lutheranism and Calvinism then, differ from each other, and the difference does owe, as I've just hinted, a lot to the different circumstances in which they find themselves. That tells us a lot about the character of the two Protestant waves. With Luther, one pivotal aspect of Lutheranism's engagement with life on earth, the earthly world, if you like, the unregenerate world of politics, etc., is his downgrading of the visible church. Luther, in reaction to the great claims of the Roman Catholics, said the visible church, the church as an institution, the church as, if you like, equivalent to a princely government, or, as we might say today, to ICI, or Honda or something, is not essential to salvation. What is essential is a direct personal relationship with God, or Christ. But only slightly indirectly, this means much more power and wealth for the German princes. Because Luther also says, as you have to have, he conceded reluctantly, some sort of visible organized church, but it's just a worldly institution, an earthly institution, rather like a chancery, or we might say today rather like the Department of Health. And the people to run things on earth are the princes. But in practice, that means that power and wealth go to the princes. The princes take over the monasteries, the monastic wealth, they take over the way the visible church is governed, and 10 years later the English king Henry VIII imitates German princes like the Elector of Saxony in this, even though he's not a Lutheran. Now, the prince's support was vital in any case for Luther. Without the support of the Elector Frederick of Saxony in the early days, Luther would not have survived personally. So the princes and Luther prop each other up, and that's the way the Lutheran movement spreads. But as it gets mixed with worldly streams, it becomes a far cry from the original profound thoughts on salvation, the otherworldly aspect of Lutheranism. But this theory of princely absolutism, it is said with some justice that Luther delivered men's souls from the tyranny of the Pope to hand them over to the tyranny of the princes. This theory of princely absolutism did not go down so well outside the Germanic lands. There was almost an assumption in Lutheran political thought